All right. Hebrews it is. Still. And we are actually making some pretty good progress. Hebrews is written in 7 major sections with actually 8 if you include the closing final words. But the core of the letter is in 7 sections. It's written as a chiasmus. It has an introduction and a prologue. And then a center section surrounded by 2 sections coming in and 2 sections going out. Total of 7 sections. After the introduction, the first section deals with the superiority of Jesus, how he's superior to the angels, but also how he has our humanity. But in the middle of that, I believe Paul puts in an exhortation to pay closer attention. The second section, having established the superiority and the humanity of Jesus, he begins to talk about the role of Jesus, which in this case is the role of a high priest. He talks about how he's a faithful high priest, and he's a compassionate high priest. Again, putting in the middle between those an exhortation. This one that we must be faithful. We must not fall away the way the Israelite generation fell away. Then he comes into his main argument, which is the great work of Jesus. And rather than having his points with a exhortation in the middle, he sort of breaks his pattern here, and he moves the exhortations to the outside. So he has a beginning exhortation and an ending exhortation, so the core part of his letter is not interrupted. And we're now into the core part of the letter. We're talking about the first point, which is a better priesthood. And this core of the letter will consist of 3 points. We see that it's a better priesthood, a better offering, and a better result. And we're starting out in that with the background of Melchizedek. Remember, he had mentioned Melchizedek. And then he said he had a lot to say about this. But first he went on to his first preliminary exhortation. Well, he's done with the preliminary exhortation. He's now coming back and he's talking about who Melchizedek is. And we saw last week that Melchizedek is a priest under Abraham, and he's a priest who's greater than the Levites. Because the Levitical priesthood was a priesthood of law. But the priesthood of Melchizedek was given before the law. And since the Levites came from Abraham, and Abraham gave his offering to Melchizedek, the Levites were essentially, he had that argument last week, which he knew was metaphorical and kind of going out there, but it made his point and clarified his point, which is that the lesser gives a blessing to the greater, the greater gives a blessing to the lesser, and since Melchizedek gave a blessing to Abraham, and Abraham's descendants were the Levites were included there, and therefore lesser than Melchizedek. So he has established that Melchizedek is greater than the Levites. When we pick up in verse 11, he begins to expand his argument even more, saying, now, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for on this basis the people received the law, what further need would there be to speak of appointing another kind of priest according to the order of Melchizedek, not one according to Aaron? One of the things I like about the book of Hebrews, it's a very logical book. Because the arguments here are laid out in very logical fashion. This one happens to be called a hypothetical syllogism, if you're really interested. But this hypothetical syllogism is if the perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood. then what need would there have been to appoint someone else? This is one of the reasons I think that this argument is written to priests. If you're a priest and you're thinking about going back to your former status because of political conflicts within the country, Paul's pointing out, or the author is pointing out, why would you do that? Why would you leave a greater priesthood and go back to a lesser priesthood? And his argument here in this section is that the Levitical priesthood is a lesser priesthood. So he does this with a rhetorical question, rhetorical argument. Can't actually answer the question, does he? But he doesn't need to, because we all know what the answer is. And that the Levitical priesthood is a lesser priesthood. Again, this whole line of argument. Notice he does not mention the temple being destroyed anywhere in here. And I think you can see now as he's unpacking his argument and expanding his argument, if the temple had been destroyed, do you think he would have mentioned it? Yeah. And notice he says, for on this basis the people received the law. Do we normally think of the Levitical priesthood as separate from the law? We got the law and the Levitical priesthood. In fact, the law contains the prescriptions for the Levitical priesthood, doesn't it? They're interrelated. To have one is to have the other. Thus, verse 12, when a change in the priesthood takes place, there must also be a change in the law. Why would that be?
Because they're tied together.
They're tied together. You can't have one without the other. That's an extremely important point here. And it's core to his argument. I mean, we're sort of tempted. It's a nice short verse. It just says, when the change in priesthood takes place, there must be a change in the law. Right, move on. But think about that for a second. Why must there be a change in the law? Must there really be a change in the law? Could you change the priesthood without changing the law? No, because they are intertwined. When Moses came down and gave the law, he did not give the priestly law and the other law. It was the law. And when you get into Leviticus, there's a lot of priestly stuff in that book, isn't there? But is it all just combined to Leviticus so we can throw the rest of it away and just keep Leviticus? No. Could we just throw Leviticus away? Maybe we'd like to. But no, because it's an important part as well. It's all intertwined. You can't pick and choose. It's not a smorgasbord where you can walk down and have a little bit from here and a little bit from there. As exciting as that is to our culture, that's not something that we can really do. So, when a change occurs, a priesthood, there must be a change in the law. What was the change in the law that took place? Are we under the law? Kind of, but not yet. When you say no, there's an implied assumption. Because when we think the law, what do we think? We're under the Mosaic law? No, we're not under the Mosaic law. Does that mean we're lawless? We can do whatever we want? What are we under? The law of grace. So we have two laws. We have the law given by Moses, but it's still God's law, the law of God given through Moses. We have the law of Jesus, which is the law of grace. So there was a change in the law. And as Christians, we're no longer under the Mosaic law, we are under the law of grace. Which means what? When there's a change in the priesthood takes place, there must also be a change in the law. When there's a change in the law, there must be also a change in the priesthood. Yes?
Is it fair to say then that God, when he established Mosaic law, knew that it was imperfect, and that's why Jesus had to come to bring perfection to his plan?
Yeah, but I would make a tweak to that, because it was not that the law was imperfect as much as we are imperfect. What does the law ultimately reveal? That the law is flawed, or that we are flawed? Yeah, so it's not that the law is flawed or imperfect, it's just that we could never be saved through it. And yeah, when he gave the law, he knew exactly how the story was going to end.
An illustration I like to use is just as John was a forerunner of Christ, the law was a forerunner of grace.
Yes.
The law couldn't save, it could only point out our flaws. It could only point out our need for salvation. That's all the law can do.
I like that. I hadn't heard that before, but I like that a lot. As the law, as John was the forerunner for Christ, the law was the forerunner for grace. Because it prepared the way. If you look at the time of Abraham and the time that existed, and then you look at what happened under the law, it essentially prepared for the time. And it wasn't the only factor that was going on. God was preparing the entire world for Christ's coming.
I mean, this is going back, and I maybe shouldn't do this, but Melchizedek was, chapter 7, verse 1, Melchizedek was a king of Salem and a priest of God Most High.
Yes.
This was prior to any law. And so he's a priest of a city, and there must have been people there.
Yep.
And maybe those people weren't listening to that priest either. I don't know. It's not explained. It's so cryptic. There's no satisfaction with any of that. So.
Yeah, but as I was mentioning before, I think that's why Paul picks Melchizedek. He picks him because he's kind of an empty vessel into which Paul, or the author, can pour his main point. I mean, it's not that he's inventing this. Melchizedek does fit what he's trying to say, but it also, there's not a lot there. So if there had been a lot more details, what we would have seen was that Melchizedek was a flawed human being like everybody else. But by having just a little bit there that's there, again, it's one of these interesting aspects about scriptures. When Moses was writing down the account, he had no idea, I'm sure, how important those little verses about Melchizedek were going to end up being, and how they would be used later on. Now, one other this is definitely a side note, but Mormons have a concept of a dual priesthood. They believe that when you have become a priest of Aaron, and then you kind of become a priest of Melchizedek. And they see as a dual priesthood. Is there any concept of a dual priesthood here? No, and in fact, when a change in priesthood takes place, there must also be a change in the law. It sort of excludes it. You can be under one, or you can be under the other. be under both. Think about it. Can you be under the law and under grace at the same time?
Different.
No, you can't. Literally, you can't. Because when you're under the law, why do you do things?
Fear.
Because it's the law. Well, it may be fear, it may be respected, but it's because I need to do this because the law says I need to do this. Where you're under grace, why do you do things?
It's a totally different motivation.
Yes,
You
it
do it
is.
out of gratitude. You do it, because of what God has done for us, not because of what we have to do to.
Yeah, which may or may not be fear, but it's a different motivation. It's a different mindset.
And the law was drudgery. It was monotonous drudgery. The sacrifices. You read about that, and it's like, this is horrible. This is awful. J. Vernon McGee has a whole sermon series, and he says the law was an awful thing. It was horrible. It was never meant to cure anything. It was just meant to show us how devoid of righteousness we are. But the law of grace steps in, and the motivation is totally different.
Totally different. So you can't be under both. Right? You can't be under obligation and under grace at the same time because they're mutually exclusive. Verse 13. For the person we are talking about belongs to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. Who's he talking about?
Jesus.
Jesus, yeah. Yeah, by this point in the letter, it's pretty clear he doesn't need to use the name anymore. Right? And I think there's a subtle point and reason he doesn't use the name here. If you're doing public speaking and you're trying to do persuasive public speaking, or if you're just talking to a friend and you're trying to persuade a friend, which is more important, or which is better? Is it better to tell them what they should think, or is it better to lead them so they reach the conclusion you want them to reach on their own?
You have to get them high.
Yeah. And that's what he's doing here. Welcome. He doesn't use the name because he doesn't need to. And it's more powerful when that name pops into your head by itself. For the person we are talking about belongs to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. We're in Hebrews 7:14. Furthermore,
It's talking about the tribe of Judah.
yeah. Yeah, but again, he doesn't have to say, does it? Because we all know. Although there's we'll come to that in this verse here. Furthermore, it is obvious that our Lord was a descendant of Judah, and Moses said nothing about priests coming from that tribe. So it is clear. It is obvious. Now, one of the things interesting is here in Revelations 5:5 are the only places that's mentioned in Scripture, other than the genealogies of Matthew and Luke. This isn't exactly, not complete proof, but it does tend to argue that if you're going to argue that something's clear, aren't you basically saying it's well known? Everybody knows this. Which I think at least supports the idea that either Matthew or Luke were in existence at the time this letter was written. Actually, both were. But I think that this was the common ground that he was pulling from. Whoever wrote this letter, again, I think it was Paul, but whoever wrote this letter, I think had access to both Matthew and certainly Luke. And that's the background of what he's saying here. But going back to his argument is that a new priesthood is needed. And Jesus, the person he's talking about, could not be part of the Levitical priesthood. He would have to come from a different priesthood. Because Moses said nothing about someone from Judah being in the Levitical priesthood. So if Jesus comes as a priest and is a priest, he cannot be a Levitical priest. He has to be from some other priesthood. That's the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is already established as a superior priesthood. You see how he's laying out his argument here? That's, if you're not used to reading through logical step-by-step arguments, it can be a little daunting to read through this. But when you break it down to its pieces and you just go through it step by step by step, it actually lays out into a very coherent and powerful argument. Now, he's established that Melchizedek was above the Levitical priesthood, that a new priesthood was needed because the old priesthood wasn't sufficient, and that a change in the law, i.e. from the law to grace, required a new priesthood, a change in the priesthood, and that Jesus could not be part of the Levitical priesthood. So what are his qualifications to be a priest? And that's where he goes next, in verse 15. This point is even more obvious in that another priest who was like Melchizedek has appeared. Do you think Paul's pretty confident in his arguments at this point? He's throwing around the word obvious a lot, isn't he? Now, that can either make your argument stronger or weaker. It's weaker if it's not really obvious. If you claim something's obvious to somebody, or if you've ever had somebody claim something's obvious to you, and you know it's not obvious, what happens to their argument at that point? It falls apart. But we know from the way this letter was very, very carefully written, the structure and style and its word uses, that Paul is not haphazardly overextending himself rhetorically. So he's making obvious arguments that are really obvious, to the point of, I know I really shouldn't have to say this, but I want to make sure I don't skip over any steps. So this point is even more obvious than another priest who is like Melchizedek has appeared. So we do now have another priest, i.e. Jesus, who has appeared, which basically reinforces everything he's been talking about. Verse 16. Who was appointed to be a priest, not on the basis of genealogical registry, but rather on the power of an indestructible life. How did a Levitical priest get to be a Levitical priest? He was Levi. Was his father, was his father, was his father, was his father. So was it anything inherent about him? No. How did Jesus get to be a priest? Because of who he, well, you could say this was his father. But it wasn't the genealogy, it was the person and nature who he was. So, indestructible. The spell checker's my friend, especially when she sits in the front row. No, thank you. Notice the contrast that's being laid out here. On the one hand, you have the Levitical priesthood, which is basically done fleshly commandments and results in regulation. And how do we think of the law? Of regulation, of regulation, of regulation. Some to the point that we don't even understand the meaning behind the regulations. Why cannot a Jewish person eat a cheeseburger? Well, there's a rule about boiling a calf in its mother's milk, right? But why? Why did they have that rule? And there's some theories, there's two theories as to why. One is that it was a practice of the Canaanites and they should not do anything that the Canaanites do. And the other was that milk is figurative of life and meat is death, and you should not intermix life and death. Right? But we don't know exactly why. Right? All we know is that you shouldn't do that, and if you're a devout Jew, you will not eat a cheeseburger, which would make it really hard for me to be a cheeseburger. I mean, to be a Jew. Particularly if I go to Southern California and I get to go to In-N-Out Burger, which is, when I go to Southern California, that's one of the places I always go.
The Jewish people that will not put very polished meat on the same plate. That's why they have so many different plates.
Like between Passover and your ordinary day, and between dairy and.
Yeah. But what does it become? It takes a commandment
Regulation.
and becomes regulation. And at some point, we don't even know what the regulations are for, right? Why shouldn't I eat a cheeseburger when I go to In-N-Out? Which, by the way, is the best place to get a cheeseburger in the world. But when I went back from my mother's funeral, they had our In-N-Out burger in Reno. We did stop and we did have an In-N-Out burger, even though I just come from dinner.
You know, when you're talking about they don't even know where it comes from, you can ask 95 out of 100 Jews, why do you do this? It's tradition. They don't know why. It's just, it's tradition.
It's tradition. And there's a lot to be said for tradition.
Right, but if you don't know where it's coming from, then it's useless.
I don't know if I go quite that far, but yeah, it's regulation.
If you don't seek to find out
If you
where it
don't
comes
seek, yeah.
from, it's useless.
That's a better way of putting it. On the other hand, what do we have with Jesus? This derives from his indestructible life. And notice what the text says. Who was appointed to be a priest, not on the basis of genealogical registry, but on the power of an indestructible life. That's where we live. This is the life of grace. Where would you rather be? Would you rather be with commandments and regulations or life and power?
The last 3 days we were in Washington, D.C., and we ran into a lot of regulations. So yeah, you know, this is a good reminder for me. I'd rather be over there.
And sometimes those regulations have the same thing. We don't know why. It's just
In certain buildings, we were told which steps we couldn't use.
verse 17. For it is declared about him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. This is Psalms 110, verse 4. It's also was quoted earlier in 5:6. Think about this psalm. When were the Psalms written? what were the people under who wrote this? They were under the law. In fact, this is, depending on how you start things, it's within what we could easily consider the middle of the law period, right? The law had been around for hundreds of years, and it was going to be around for hundreds of years more before Jesus came. So in the middle of all this, we get this psalm written. You are preached forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Why would anybody under the law pick out this priest from Genesis and suddenly talk about you are a priest forever? I can't actually think of any reason anyone would do that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, it does if you realize that the law was created by God to point us towards something better. These people are chafing under the law. They're tired of it. They want something better. I think the enlightened ones.
Yeah, if you remove God from the picture and you look at only secular means, I'm just a priest. I'm writing away, and I'm going to write this thing, and it's going to become part of Scripture, right? We just make it up as we go along. There's no real reason to do this.
Well, he was a priest king, so he was like the higher order of priests. Right?
But who in the middle of the law is going to be thinking that way?
Okay.
They're saying in the middle of the law, I'm going to write this psalm that extols how wonderful it was by this guy, and this guy's who was only mentioned once until I write. And suddenly he's going to be, you're a priest forever? Yeah, this is one of these little teeny tidbits that, Moses, something told Moses to write about Melchizedek. I mean, that could have been easily something that ended up on the cutting room floor, to use a movie metaphor, right? Do we have the complete description of everything that happened in the life of Abraham? There are entire decades where we don't really know anything that happened. It's like he's here, then he's there. And then skips ahead again, and he's there. All this in-between stuff gets dropped out. But for some reason, Moses felt it was important to write about Melchizedek. And then, hundreds of years later, someone else is inspired to suddenly write about Melchizedek again and say, you're a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Then, 700 years later, or more, suddenly Paul comes along, or the author of Hebrews comes along, and ties all this up together. And we suddenly know, yeah, now we know why that was written, because that's a prophecy of Christ. And yeah, now we know why Melchizedek was included. But imagine yourself unlucky enough to be a teacher of the Torah, a teacher of the rabbinical person in the 2nd century BC. And you get somebody annoying in your class, like me, and they raise their hand and says, why did they mention Melchizedek, and why is Melchizedek again mentioned in the Psalms? What would you be able to tell them? Hello. Tradition.
Yeah.
Just a question, did all of the Levites serve in the priesthood?
No.
There
were actually some qualifications. For example, if you were, I believe if you were lame or had some sort of illness, that.
Well, let's say you're able-bodied, brilliant young man. Did you have to serve in the priesthood?
I would think not, because there would have been too many. Well, there were thousands and thousands of them.
Because, I mean, talk about getting stuck in a job you don't want to do. Just because you're born that way?
Workers in the temple.
Yeah, this is why I'm not that familiar with.
I'm not either, and that's, this stuff crossed my mind. It's like in the old Soviet Union, this is what you're going to do for your living,
Yeah. Yeah, you go to the, Judea job fair, they look at your resume, Levi, well, we got a position for you.
He faints at the sight of blood. It's just not a good match.
Verse 18. Indeed, because it was a weakness and ineffective. Indeed, because it was weak and ineffective, the former commandment has been annulled, since the law made nothing perfect, and had a better hope is presented, by which we approach God. So he ties this together by saying, after having introduced the Melchizedek, introduced how the Levitical priesthood was lesser the priesthood than Melchizedek, he introduced how Jesus is qualified for that he's brought a new priesthood. He says, indeed, because it was weak and ineffective. What was weak and ineffective? The former priesthood. Because it was weak and ineffective, the former commandments have been annulled. Again, can you conceive of how the author would not have mentioned the temple being destroyed at this point? No. So this had to have been written prior to the destruction of the temple. Since the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is presented by which we approach God. What's the better hope? Jesus. Again, notice how he's not mentioning Jesus in this passage. But we all know who it is. Instead, he uses the word obvious. He's not putting forth just an argument here. He's putting forth a really powerful argument. How could you go back to that priesthood? How could you abandon this better hope and go back to something that's weak and ineffective? By which we approach God. Is that how you think of salvation? When we went through 1 John, what was the key thing about salvation or our new status that John kept putting forth? Why was sin such a bad thing? It separated us from God. It damaged the relationship that we could have with God.
License destroys freedom.
License destroys freedom. Yes, it does.
License destroys your relationship. The freedom comes from God.
That's why when you read ancient philosophers like Aristotle or Plato or even Cicero, one of the things they consistently point out about the law is the freedom in the law. This freedom is not licentiousness. It is not the ability to do whatever you want to do on a whim's notice.
In our culture today, it sure seems that way.
Yeah.
We're destroying freedom all over, and we're promoting license at every turn.
Yeah. Well, why do you think they don't really teach, at least a lot of schools don't, teach the Nicomachean ethics any longer. Because it's a book by Aristotle. It's a great book to read. It's available online. I highly recommend you download that book and read it. Read it in chunks. It's by a philosopher, it's by Aristotle. Right? It's not per se Christian, but there's very little of anything in there. You'd have to be hypersensitive as a Christian to be offended by anything in there, or even to disagree with anything in there. Because it basically lays out a intellectual argument for why we should be good. And what does it mean to be moral? They don't teach that any longer because that would raise too many difficult questions.
Well, that's because Aristotle sounds like one of those religious rants.
Actually, it'd be more along the lines of, Socrates and Plato battled against a group of philosophers called the Sophists. And the Sophists argued that there was no such thing as absolute truth. That truth was just whatever you wanted it to be. That sound familiar? Yeah. If you want to really understand what Sophists were and how they thought and how they argued, look at modern culture. Because modern culture today embodies Sophism. The intellectual underpinnings of our current culture is Sophism, which is essentially what Socrates and Plato and Aristotle repudiated 2,000 years ago.
And you can espouse sophistry, but nobody in reality lives like it, because you couldn't have any kind of trusting agreement.
Yeah, you can only, sophists are, it's like an 80% philosophy. It's 80% of the time you can kind of make sense of it, but boy, it's like, well, there's no right and wrong. Right?
Well, you couldn't
And
have any contractual agreement.
Well, someone tells me there's no right and wrong, then I usually do something like that. Well, so it's okay if I take your keys and drive your car off then.
Exactly.
And if they object, I would say, why do you object?
That's the story Bill Bennett tells. He had a friend who's a relativist, and invited him to dinner, and Bill said, I'll pay, and so the guy ordered, something pretty nice, and at the end of dinner, they had a nice conversation. The guy says, so you're going to pick up the bill? And Bill said, no, I've changed my mind. It's on you. Nobody's a sophist. You have to have trust.
Yeah.
To have any kind of a relationship, you need to have a higher authority, higher legal authority.
Which is why, again, people don't read the Nicomachean Ethics much anymore, because it makes those uncomfortable points. And the really thing about it is when you start saying that there are some law that we are obligated to, that has a nasty connotation to that. That means I could be wrong. I might do something bad, which is why Sophism is so important to our modern world. Let's go ahead and end there, and we will pick up next time in verse 20. Let's go ahead and close in the word of prayer.